welcome
It's a great honor to be here.
Well, thank you very much. So tell us about your new book, Your Evolving Soul.
Well, it came to me kind of out of the blue, really 20 years ago, believe it or not, that this issue of the soul was a core teaching in the Urantia book that not too many people were talking about. But in the New Age community, a lot of people were talking about, life after life. And in not just New Age community, but everybody was, the interest in NDEs has been rising, ever since. And it was really, Alfred, because I kind of had a memory of a mini NDE that I had as a child that came up for me when I was actually reading a passage in the Urantia book and thinking about writing this book. And then I suddenly remembered that I had kind of a life review experience one time. And that was the point of departure for this, because I realized that what the NDEers are talking about is similar to what the Urantia book is talking about. And that gives us some empirical support for the Urantia book that there isn't a whole lot for. There's some significant that you may not know, we can talk about later, having to do with the physics of the Urantia book. There's significant things, but in the area of soul evolution, the only time it really struck me that there's empirical evidence is these hundreds of cases of life review, which I'm sure you have talked about on this program, that people have in these NDEs. And I had a near drowning incident where my life flashed before my eyes just before the lifeguard pulled me out of the pool, and seemed like my entire life was present in kind of a hologram, and I mean in detail, and it not as dramatic as you hear in the true NDEs where people are out of body and pronounced dead, but it was a near-death experience, and I saw scenes from my life, my parents, my siblings, my pets. And I was like, how could I know this? How could I bring this to mind? And I think the Urantia book provides the answer to how that is possible, that I think is more interesting and plausible than a lot of other folks. But the closest, I think, maybe comes from Edgar Cayce, and people that follow with Edgar Cayce. Alfred, as you know, his notion of an Akashic record, and going out and finding the library that has the record of your life, and there's this bearded man who pulls down the book of your life, right? And that's where he got a lot of his information about people. And the Urantia book doesn't talk about the Akasha per se, but it is much like it, but it has kind of two branches here. One aspect of it is that there's the record of every moment of your life. And second aspect is there's the record of every spiritually significant moment in your life. So those are two aspects. And I think that that Casey's right, that there is, and so the NDEers are right, that there's a record of every moment of your life, which makes sense, I think, because having memory is critical in cosmology and in theology and in psychology. You need to have access to the past. I mean, in everything, in law, whatever it may be, we need to memorialize, what has happened in the past. So why wouldn't the universe have memory? And we've learned that from Rupert Sheldrake in particular, that the universe seems to remember, biological evolution such that animals participate in the memory or the field, the morphic field, which is the memory of the behavior of animals over millennia, over eons. And that field is what determines or helps condition animal evolution and plant evolution. But the same thing has got to be the case for humans. And as you may know, Irvin Laszlo has made a big deal out of this, and so is even Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber's evolutionary theories ultimately come down to the presence of a morphogenetic field that is the memory of the past, and that is the context for evolution that's growing through evolution. So that's maybe a little long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of, I was, all this stuff was swimming around, and I had studied some of these theories, but I recognized that the Urantia revelation has baggage. If you come into the field, you have to explain the source of this information, and a lot of folks don't have the patience for that. I know that, recognize that, and I sympathize. It's a huge investment to read and learn that tome, as you called it. It is a tome, but I wrote the book for those who don't have time to read the tome, so it's introductory to it, but with special reference to the soul and soul evolution. And so, because as you said at the outset, the soul development is a central theme for cosmology, and for your work, and your book Omniverse, of course, is a central focus on the soul. and for that matter, the religions do too. Especially the Abrahamic religions. Certainly, Christianity is all about the soul. So we need to come to terms with the traditions, what they say about the soul. And so the other mission I had in my research was, well, what does Christianity actually say about the soul? What does Judaism say about the soul in detail? What does Islam say about the soul? And it's better known in my circles what Hinduism says about the soul, and Buddhism. And it's widely varying, but it's almost all of it, Alfred, is pretty vague, which is why we needed to get input, in our time from extraterrestrials or angelics who are coming to teach us what the traditions couldn't figure out. And in fact, the traditions couldn't have contained the information we have. They just didn't have the intellectual matrix to talk about these things, because they didn't have a cosmology of any significance, and they didn't even have evolution. They didn't even know about evolution. And you can't really talk about the soul unless you talk about its growth. And one thing in particular, also germane to your book, The Omniverse, and Michael Newton, for example. Michael Newton has the view that the soul is like an egg of light, I think you call it, or it's like a hologram of light that's a fragment of the divine. And that is actually the inverse of what I think is true. Because if it were a fragment of the divine alone, then it couldn't evolve. It couldn't change, because by definition, divinity is something that is changeless. Although you can have a theory that says divinity does evolve, and that's a separate issue. But what Michael Newton in his terrific books is talking about is what the Urantia book calls the spirit. It's the spirit self, not the evolving soul. So my mission was to show that the distinction between the spirit, the indwelling spirit, and the soul is critical for us to understand sort of the purpose of our lives. Because the way I would put it is, the purpose of our life is to evolve the soul until the soul becomes one with divinity. But we start out, far from that. So if the soul was already a fragment of divinity, there'd be no purpose to grow up. You'd already be there. So it's a logical, error, I think, in what Newton has inferred from his work, if I read it right. But that's also the case with major religions. For example, Hinduism. Hinduism doesn't discern the presence of a co-evolving soul until later, much, much later. But classic Hinduism just has a spirit self that they call the Atman, right? It's a changeless. Atman is like a fragment of Brahman. thou art that. The Atman is a fractal of Brahman, who is the God of the universes, right? So we're not trying to evolve our souls. We're trying to get out of here and back to Brahman. So this is why it really suits a medieval cosmology, to say there is no evolution of the self that is spiritually significant. What we really want to do is declare the universe is an illusion. At least 3D dimension is an illusion, and there's nothing to do here other than get out of it. Through meditation, through practices, various yogas, which identify you with the spirit self, with the Atman, and so that could be a fallacy as well. Not to be harsh with these folks, but because they at least they busted through lots of confusion to come up with the doctrine of the Atman. It's a fabulous teaching. And then Buddhists pick up from there, as you may know. I mean, the Buddhism takes on the same notion of a spiritual self that they call the Buddha nature. But Buddha refined that to his eternal credit and made it a much more robust concept of where he said there's no self there. There's no, that the Atman is ineffable. The spirit, the indwelling spirit is ineffable, and you can't make a thing out of it. You can't make a fetish out of it, which is what the Hindus, he said Hinduism was fetishizing the indwelling spirit. But Buddha said, this is something which is spacious, which is outside of space and time, in fact, and which is intangible in every sense, which is why they coined the term shunyata, which means it's empty. This notion of emptiness in Zen Buddhism, which makes people laugh. What they really meant is that you can't attribute anything to the spirit self, because it's totally transcendental. That's why you have to sit in Zen posture to recognize there is nothing there that you can put your hands on, right? Because it's at the highest level of vibration, and it is cannot be contacted. So the Christianity comes in. Let me just pause there. How was that? Is it going too far, too fast, or?
No, I think that is a very, a very full introduction to the complex truth of the soul, and people who I know who are engaged in these discussions would come back and say, oh, but wait, where you have the fractal of a hologram that's not fully manifesting in this reality, well, of course, they're not, the principle of a hologram is that the whole is contained in each part of the whole. However, if there's a person in this reality that's not even acknowledging that they have a soul, is their soul evolving? I mean, there are all these paradoxes. So,
yeah.
I was contemplating last night, is just becoming aware that you have a soul is an evolutionary act, and it does help evolve the soul. So I was just thinking, in the same sense that we talk about energy being both a wave and a particle, perhaps our soul can be holographic in that sense of being a holographic particle, that is, the whole being in each part of the whole, and being an evolving part. And that is that we have to work at it to fully inhabit and to fully activate our soul. I really like your phrase here, we are all soul makers. Perhaps you want to go into that phrase at some point that you outlined there. Anyway, you asked me, so.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, that's helpful because it's close to the model that I'm presenting, which is that the spirit self, or the Urantia book calls it many other things, but let's call it the spirit, the indwelling spirit, is our awareness of it is soul making. And there's lots of aspects to that, because if we're not aware of it, let's say a child, for example, do we say, well, the child has no soul development because they're not aware of their spiritual self, of their indwelling spirit? And so the Urantia book answer, and the one that I think makes sense, is that no, the soul is in development from the earliest age and happens behind the scenes, and the child doesn't know that this development is occurring, but the child is just making decisions, making choices, which register in and as the soul. And that's sort of the first proposition. The second proposition is that the spirit self is not the mechanism, but the function that allows that to happen. It actually is it monitors the life of the child, and it saves each experience that is soul making. So it has that job. So it's a different task than the soul's task. The task of the spirit self, the God fragment, this hologram, is to monitor the life and inspire your life. And it literally selects that which is worth immortalizing. And it could do that. You couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. I couldn't decide what part of what I'm doing should be in my soul. So in most of the religions, it's some sort of deity that's determining the soul. But this is an indwelling deity, and it has the exclusive role of recognizing soul-making decisions and activities and experiences. So that's why we have to make a logical or ontological distinction between the spirit and the soul, because they have very different tasks. And the soul actually is a little bit more passive. It's receiving these records, these soul memories, into this container, you might say, and it's just building itself up to the point that the child begins to become soul conscious. But it may never become soul. You may go through your whole life and be a Wall Street executive, and you're never soul conscious, but you have a soul. You've developed a soul because you have the spirit self that is saving into the soul your life experience. It's doing it behind the scenes regardless. I don't care if you're Hitler or Mother Teresa. This is happening, and you rarely know, probably never know, what is truly soul making. So it's unconscious. And if it were conscious, you'd be pretty enlightened. you'd be really enlightened. So Buddha, yes, maybe Jesus, maybe. So but once you're self-aware of your soul, you are moving toward higher levels of consciousness, because you start identifying with your soul instead of your body, right? Or instead of your mundane existence, you're like, oh, I'm an evolving soul. I think I should be working at a higher level in my profession. I should be contributing more. I should improve my ethical behavior, because that builds the soul, versus not doing ethical, doing things that are unethical. People that go out doing, criminal activity and unethical behavior don't care. I mean, they don't realize that they are poisoning their own soul. They have no soul awareness. But now subsidiary to that is the notion that the soul is also a record of your bad behavior, which is what we see in near-death experience. When people have a life review, they see their bad behavior. And I hadn't read this material, Alfred, until I started working on the book. And was kind of amazed at these accounts, and I started going to their conferences, the near-death experience conferences, and hearing these people get up there and say, I had a life review and I hated my life. It was a terrible life. But that's what they showed me. And I asked them to turn it off, like turn off the TV show. And the angels there were saying, well, we can't turn it off because you have to review your life. That's why you're here. But we're here to tell you, you're forgiven. We understand. Life is tough down there. People do things they don't want to do. But it's saved in and as your soul, because this is your life. This is your choices. And we value your choices, even if they're not very good choices. So the decisions you make, good, bad, or ugly, form your character. And the character is closely related to your soul. So we want to accurately reflect your character. And that's done by the mechanism of the spirit self. And it loves everything we do, in the sense that everything we do, it contributes to evolution of the universe. Even if we're Joseph Stalin, it's a contribution. I know it sounds ironic, sounds almost perverse to say that's a contribution, but it is what actually occurred in Russia in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s is an evolution of consciousness. And so we want to be able to go back and review that record, the soul record and the collective soul record, and find the patterns. So we need to say that we're not going to, it's not just happy news. So the universe doesn't want to just put out the happy news. It wants to put out the gritty news, the earthy and sort of, the soulful news, with soul meaning in this sense, like soul music or, blues music, which is, lots of things happen that make you sad and make you mournful, but those are poignant. And you learn from adversity more than you do from success. So this is a reason why the universe has a design which saves even the life and story of George Bush, and says, look at this, review this, look at this life. What kind of life was this? How does it compare to other lives? What values did George Bush put forward, or Dick Cheney, for example? And that's there and measurable and discernible by higher beings. And so when people talk about going to judgment in the religions, it's something like this, that the higher realms know you better than you know yourself. They know, sort of like Santa Claus, he knows when you've been good. They know when so they know you in perfection. And, this is really our theology would say the divine is omniscient. The divine knows you better than you know you. And not only that, it's not just some remote corner of the universe where divinity is looking in on you. Divinity is inside of you looking in on you. So the divinity has a window to watch your life, and wants to, it's sort of like it's the parent wanting to know the life of the child. So the parent's taking video and, taking photographs on its iPhone, wanting to memorialize the life of the child. In fact, a parent wants to immortalize the life of the child, right? This is your child. You want your child to be known forever as your child, and so you have a picture book of images from the child's life. And so the divine has the same thing. The divine has, holographic, sort of video database of your life for review for those who have the rights to access this life. So getting access is the job of the angelic host. Your own angels are intimately involved with your story, your life story. They know it better than you do. So they can shuttle through your life story, so to speak, and see what your needs are. and that's how they minister to you. Not unlike how a teacher knows their student. The teacher knows what the student needs to learn next. That's the job of the teacher. So it's the job of the universe is to move you along in your lessons. So they have to have, so the soul is essential for that. And I go further and say that evolution of consciousness itself, the universal evolution of consciousness, is driven by soul development of all the individuals. So it's these individuals, not just on this planet, but other planets, as we all progress, the whole universe progresses. And as the whole universe progresses, each individual participates in that. So this is huge field, the oversoul. And I like the fact that in your book, Alfred, you speak of soul as non-local. And so I totally agree with that. So the soul is non-local in the sense that it is local to you, but it's available to the oversoul. And the oversoul's everywhere. It's absorbing your life experience into itself. So it's just, this, gigantic record of the past. So as how that has to do with time travel, I don't know. I haven't researched that sufficiently, but we can turn to Rupert Sheldrake, I think, for empirical evidence that the past is present. Right? He calls it the presence of the past. The past is always present in the field, in the current field. And so the more advanced person has access to that. Same thing as being like in government or something. If you're a government official and you have no idea of the history of the nation, you're kind of an idiot. I mean, look at Trump. I mean, he doesn't really know his history. So, how can you make any decisions that are wise? So, the universe has got to make much better decisions than that in order to manage and become a sustainable universe. It has to know where it's going, and so it's saved in and as the soul. And I guess I should add now, I'll throw in another element here that is unique to the Urantia book, if I may. And that is the notion that there is another part of the self. So we have two crucial parts of the self, of the architecture of the self. That's the soul, it's evolving, it's co-created by you and the spirit. And then there's the spirit, which is this fragment of the divine. But there's yet another part that is not recognized in the religions very well. For example, in the Bible, there is a reference to we are made in the image of God. And if we are in the image of God, then, literally, then there must be some kind of fractal of God that is our unique self. And that is a very different notion than what I've been talking about. So the uniqueness of the self, that is just look at each person, their physiognomy is unique. Their demeanor is unique. Their voice is unique. They have a voice print. They have fingerprints. The uniqueness of the body itself, of the anatomy is unique. All these things are specific, and this is because there's another element, which I call the architecture of the self, that has three elements. So this third element is not recognized in the NDE literature and the paranormal literature very well. And that is what the Urantia book calls personhood or personality, and by which they do not mean behavior. So we typically say personality is, in today's psychology, personality is your behavioral traits. But they don't mean it that way. They mean that the personality, the personhood is the highest part of the self, which is the unique self that is actually unchanging. And it is the container for the self. And what I like to say is that it unifies us. So in other words, we got all these different parts, these organs, the brains, all these thoughts, and our soul's developing. Well, what's going to hold this thing together? Because even the spirit part of the self is very dynamic. It's doing a lot. It's monitoring your life, and it's saving things into the soul. But there's got to be a part that, like in systems theory, there's always a principle that is the unifier, the systematizer. So I'm saying here that there's a systematizing entity that has two big attributes that are not easily recognized in psychology, and that is the ability to be self-aware, which if you just look at animal behavior, for example, animals are not particularly known to be self-aware, except unless they're dolphins, maybe. Likely, very likely, that dolphins are self-aware. And, some higher animals would appear to be self-aware, but not the way we're self-aware. They recognize themselves in a mirror. We don't think that they reflect deeply on their lives. We don't think that they review their past behavior so they can make better choices, although they do learn, but they're not reflective. So this capacity to be reflective is unique to us. And as Plato and others would say, this is a divine quality. To be self-aware, self-reflective is a very high attribute. So what we're saying is that the person comes in with the ability to be self-aware, divinely granted to them. And secondly, and corollary to that, is the person's self-awareness is tied to their freedom, their free will, and their ability to make free choices. And as you know, Alfred, in political theory, the notion of human rights comes from the possibility of the sovereignty of the individual. So you can't have a Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations and other constitutions that confer rights on people to vote and to be protected and all of those things that we do in government. And legal rights are based on the autonomy of the individual, and that's related to their freedom, their inherent freedom. I guess we call this natural law. So the inherent freedom that individuals have from infancy is not something that's biological. It's not evolving over time. It is granted to us by the Creator. And that's why we say we're made in the image of God, because God is a self-aware being. God is not the Force. The Force is not self-aware. That's kind of a degraded idea of God. If God is not a self-aware being, then it's doesn't have much to inspire me. So God is a self-aware person, meaning that deity is personally able to love and be loved. So the fact that deity is loving, means if we are created by this deity, we can be loving, we can be caring, we can be relational with other persons. So this is the second attribute of the personality, if you will, which is the free to choose, and hopefully choose love and not fear, or etc. And so that freedom and that ability to be self-aware, reflective, are divine attributes granted by Source, granted by God the Father and Mother on each human being. Each extraterrestrial human is another divine gift. So what I'm saying, Alfred, is that there are two great divine gifts. One is the spirit self, that obviously cannot be self-created by us. And secondly, the personality, which is actually the most important principle of the self, is personhood, with its inherent rights, its inherent powers and prerogatives in the universe. And, universe law recognizes the individual as sovereign and having rights. And that's because it's granted, as Jefferson would say, this is, nature and nature's God granted these unalienable rights on the person, but we distinguish that from the soul. So the soul is not the principle here, and not even is the spirit the principle. It's the image of God within, that gives us our unique and infinitely valuable uniqueness. And so this uniqueness needs to be protected, preserved, supported, upheld by the universe, by universe government, but certainly by planetary government. And so in my book, I show that there are these three parts of the self, and that they work, of course, in perfect harmony and even perfect unity, so much so that you have no awareness of it. So the only way to separate these elements out is really by revelation, and which is why it took declarations from Jesus, Buddha, and others. These are declarations that great sages, discovered through introspection, and also by observing others, that there's these attributes of the self. And we can then go and you can test these things. And that's why I think we've been gifted with these near-death experiences, in particular, as paranormal evidence of these religious and revelatory teachings. So we didn't really have much of that evidence in the past. We had little anecdotes. Even Plato has an anecdote of a near-death experience in one of his dialogues, but we didn't have systematic study of it until 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And we're beginning to see the architecture of the self, and then how it fits in with the cosmology. So you get to this big, debate about what is the cosmology. Something is here that's really special and has a certain sovereignty. But what is the context that that's in? And so we can all agree to disagree about that. And I think the Urantia cosmology is a better place to start. It's not the last word by any means, but it's definitely a very good reference text to make a core reference text. Not the only one. There are other reference texts, but it's a very key reference text for a cosmology in which cosmos in which you can place the self and what its purpose is. So with the Urantia revelation, you get this gigantic, universe that, with due respect, your little passage about the Urantia book in your book accurately describes the Urantia cosmology in a couple of paragraphs, and you compare it to Lind and Ranchurian, or I think the guy's name, and their notion of billions and billions of universes, and I don't think that their model is a very good model. I think it's a mathematical proposal, but the Urantia book has says there's 7 trillion inhabited planets, and they were saying that in the 1930s when it came through. I mean, it was way ahead of in the 1930s. We barely had the Hubble's first telescope, and we didn't even know there was a Milky Way. We knew there was a Milky Way, but they didn't know there was any other galaxies when the Urantia book came through. And the Urantia book comes through and says there are millions and millions of galaxies, and there's 7 trillion inhabited worlds. That's so far ahead of its time, and it's still ahead of its time. It could be wrong, but it's plausible because as opposed to what the mathematical physics has come up with, the multiverse, theories. Those are based on math and physics and observation, very laudable, but they're just material scientists. They're not theologians. They're not sages. They're not spiritually adept. And I don't know why we let them tell us about everything we need to know about the cosmos. It seems entirely wrong-headed to turn to science, to tell us what the great sacred universe is all about. I mean, they don't even believe in higher worlds. And that's why you've done a great thing by, coining the term omniverse, and teaming that with discussion of, physics and cosmology, that we have the material universe and then we have the spiritual universe, and we need to think of it together in one big concept. And that was pioneered in the Urantia book and other texts. But what I think is needed is very strong science along with very strong theology, not just one or the other. You know, you need the two together. And the reason I advocate for the Urantia book is that it gives you very strong science and very strong theology. There's really no more advanced theology that I know of. But just to make sure about that, I'm going back to school. I'm going to divinity school next year.
Oh,
And, yeah.
Well, tell us about that.
I got so far down the rabbit hole with the Urantia book, I thought I better check in with the current theology. And I was taking a lot of courses at Berkeley, Graduate Theological Unit at Berkeley, and got to know some of the professors there. And I've compared notes with one in particular who said, you probably should go to theology school because you kind of have it in your blood. And this guy knows the Urantia book, so he says, look, the Urantia book is a pretty good foundation for you, and why don't you do that? So I ended up getting accepted to Union Theological Seminary. So I'll be going there next September, and I wrote them and said, I bet you've never had anybody come who advocates the Urantia book. You've probably never heard of it. But I want to compare its theology to today's theology. And they said, okay.
Oh, gee. And where is the Union Theological Seminary?
It's the part of Columbia University that's the theological, right across the street there in Upper West Side. And, the great cathedral there where Martin Luther King gave his big speech against the Vietnam War, for the name of it. That's their church, their cathedral at the seminary. And yeah, so it's that place. And it's a place.
So you are really, I'm searching for the word prophet, or what would be the word where you are going into, you're really going into the core of the establishment of the religions with, when I think of the Urantia as not only a text, but I think of it as a living interdimensional revelation, in the sense that when I read it, I actually felt it to be a higher vibrational entity that had a momentum and life of its own. And when I finished reading it, it's as though I graduated into a next chamber of higher vibrational existence. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
That's what happens to everybody that studies it. Is they kind of intellectually they move into, they ascend, at least mentally, and it definitely does that, because you get a vibration of it, because you realize, oh my gosh, maybe all this does hang together. maybe it actually does make sense, and there's a unity to things. Whereas you never got that in your education. You just got separate subjects you study, and nobody was putting the whole picture together because they're not allowed to, because that's God, right? So finally, oh my gosh, there's a loving creator that unifies everything. And it's not just a bunch of theories. You feel that unity, that coherence. And that's intellectual, but it makes you happy. It made me joyous. And I think it did the same for you. And even if it's not exactly true, it's a pretty good shot at giving unity and coherence to the omniverse. So it's a continuous discourse.
Yeah, and it seemed that there was a bit of a mystery school to it also, that the way that it introduced terms that were kind of strangely you know, that were new and strange, and that so it was a new, you know, it was kind of like going aboard a spaceship for a while, you know, to some new and alien place, and yet when you read the last part of it, the life of Jesus as seen on universe television. I mean, that's how I kind of see it. I'm
on the radio.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, somebody interrupting. They're gone.
Yeah. No, but I forget how many parts there are, about 2 or 3 or 4 parts. Maybe.
4 parts.
Yeah, 4 parts. And the final part, I used to call it the life of Jesus on universe television. It's like you are there, you know, and
right.
And some of it was confirmed by our mutual colleague, who was a U.S. chrononaut, a time traveler, who was admitted to the U.S. secret time travel program that actually produced 2 films, 2 top classified films based on time travel that went back, and they took a group of time travelers back with a film crew, and they made a film or a video of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, and they made a film of the resurrection by getting the time coordinates and going into the cave, you know, or that event. And our mutual colleague, the chrononaut, U.S. chrononaut Andrew D. Bashago, told me that he, and has written about this independently in his Facebook group, Project Pegasus, and elsewhere, that he had witnessed the first film on the crucifixion of Jesus and described Jesus, and then that he had been told by people who had within the top secret world, who had gone into the viewing of the film on the resurrection, although he didn't have the classification to go in and see that one, but that one, Jesus got up, and, you know, the video showed the angels moving the stones apart there, and just came in, you know, he's got up in his light body or whatever, you know, and so there, you know, there is filmic, the U.S., and because some of the time travel technology, like the chronovisor, was developed by the Vatican and then subcontracted to the Department of Defense, to the Pentagon. This provides some of the institutional backing to the white hat side of the Vatican. There's a black hat side, which is a little more reptilian, and then a white hat side, which is more theological. And I've actually talked to people who have been down there. There's like a line of demarcation inside the Vatican, right? Oh, that's the black hat side. This is the white hat side. But you got it. That's like on the inside. And so, you know, so you've got empirical verification of part 4, and that's why I say it's part 4 is like watching the life of Jesus on universe television. Now, there are alternative versions, and this is where you have, and you can have all these mixings of timelines, and there's a tremendous amount of confusion where you have the Mary Magdalene, and then there's a lot of conflation about India, about was there a marriage with Mary Magdalene or was there not?
Right.
There's all of these verses, and that's fine. And then you have Flavius Josephus, who was the chief propagandist of the Jewish nation, who was hired by Rome to write a propaganda. This is independent of all of this. Right. So to make your way through there and understand this is quite the thing. But what I felt, because I had to get out of our usual kind of time-space coordinates in the United States, and it turned out that I went to Australia, to Melbourne, Australia, and I had to spend 6 months. We were preparing for a trial there, and I spent 6 months reading the Urantia book, and I read it from back to front, kind of from the particular to the most general. And I felt, and I did it as I was approaching an interdimensional entity. And I think that way, this is a non-local entity also. And that giving it that identity, I think, so it's in parallel, it's kind of a communication to the souls, which are non-local.
Yeah.
And so it's hitting you not only with the text, but there is a field of living communication around it. Now, people can say, "Oh, that's what belief systems always believe."
Yeah, they always say that. But they're right, because if it's a truly a great revelation, or even a partial revelation, even a Book of Mormon, there's something happening from some other world that's coming and kind of invading our space and teaching us. And so I think there's a portal, sort of notion that it gives you access to this portal. And the Urantia portal is a pretty big portal. A lot of things and people can go through that. But also, Alfred, remember the last time I was on, like 3-4 years ago, we talked about these new celestial teachers who have come. They're supplemental to the Urantia book. It's controversial in the Urantia movement, but it's just overwhelming evidence of this portal opening up, and new teachings are given. And these are, paranormal events, but they happen so commonly that we now have, over 6,000 contact events that are transcribed, lessons and teachings all over the world from Urantia beings. And they come from these different individuals in different cities and different places, including Australia, New Zealand, Europe, mainly United States, Canada. And they're validating the Urantia book. They're saying, we come from those realms. We're from up there. The Urantia book is telling you accurately that souls develop this way, that the self is constructed in the way that the book is telling you. But now, do you have any questions? So people are asking more new questions. And so there's been thousands of questions in these sessions. And I've been in over 200 sessions, group sessions, where these beings are saying, well, what questions do you have about the Urantia book, about its theology? So, we were asking, just last night we had a session, and I asked about reincarnation, because the Urantia book doesn't have the usual teaching on reincarnation. So it's a kind of a big deal, because I'm going out and speaking all over the place, and almost everybody says, well, what about reincarnation? And I have these past lives. And you're saying that all we do is we ascend, right? We're not coming back. We're ascending into higher worlds. So I thought I had past lives. So, these beings are saying, well, here's how it works. So it's a little bit complex, but generally that the reincarnation is a special case. It's not the general case. That you don't continually reincarnate on this planet, because one way to see that is the notion of continual reincarnation is a medieval idea, because in medieval cosmology there were hardly any notion of higher worlds, nor there was any idea of extraterrestrial worlds. So their best shot was to say, well, we keep coming back here till we get off the wheel. So this interpretation is, it could be erroneous, also theologically questionable, but man, do I get in trouble with this one. Because there's a lot of decent science that shows there's some kind of reincarnation, and there's an awful lot of testimony from people. So what the Urantia book says is that the reincarnation is never to the same planet. And when asking these beings, they state, you're thinking that you were on this planet, but you were actually on another world. And that's where you have this experience. And then you're reading into it, you're attributing to it certain characteristics. But I don't find that satisfactory. So this is an area where I don't agree, actually, with the Urantia teaching. And I have other areas too. But in this area, it doesn't add up. But what we've gotten from other beings, they've stated, and they're reluctant to state this, and I think it fits with what you're saying in the book Omniverse, is, there's certain sort of renegade beings who are making reincarnation happen on our planet. I didn't really get to your later chapters, but I think that's what you're saying, is that it's sort of being done to us. And there is support in the Urantia view of things that, number one, as you say in your first book, the planet's in quarantine. In a quarantined planet, well, it's quarantined for a reason. It had a rebellion, as you know, the Lucifer rebellion. So in the quarantining of the planet, they were quarantined from the outside, but on the inside, there were rebel angels that colluded with some extraterrestrial races to make sure the souls can't escape. So they closed off the portals. But certain souls can get through, but many of them do not, and they are made to reincarnate, which is why the Hindu sages, observed this and said, people are reincarnating. And it's just totally built into Vedic astrology and Vedic teaching that we're reincarnating. It's just, how could that be wrong? And so the notion is that this was actually an activity that was dictated by dark forces to keep us terrestrial and to keep us away from extraterrestrial contact.
Yeah, and that model that hypothesis that you just mentioned is certainly congruent and consistent with other active models of reincarnation, like Buddhism would say something like that, and other models, and even models of exopolitics would say something like that these are programs of control by specific advanced races of extraterrestrials that want to manipulate intelligent civilizations of human souls for their own purposes. Now, I wanted to ask you this question, and this is going back to the sort of the tripartite composition of the soul. And this is something that I never really have quite gotten the Urantia book. And maybe if you can explain it here, because it's something that I've never really been able to successfully integrate in my life and in others. The famous thought adjuster. It's almost like a fifth wheel. I mean, I've never been able to get that one. So could you introduce the concept of a thought adjuster to our audience including myself, because I haven't quite, in all these years, I still don't get it. And kind of walk us through it and how you feel about that concept.
Alfred, I have a feeling that your thought adjuster tweaked you to get you to ask that question.
Hey, it could have been.
Because it's there, but we already talked about it because I didn't use that term. I don't like the phrase.
Yeah.
I use the term spirit self or indwelling spirit. Same thing.
So you were talking about the thought adjuster instead of the spirit self. Now, spirit self is a very evocative term within kind of an understandable languaging, whereas thought adjuster is like, take me to the laboratory,
Yeah, I really agree. I never liked it. It just sounds so like an engineering term or something, or like an insurance term, a claims adjuster or something. But it's sort of, it's actually a common sense notion too, which is because of, so if you could somehow adjust your child, you have a child who's 8 years old and you want to be able to kind of guide your child, if you could get in there and just tweak them a little bit to, behave, not misbehave, you might do it as long as you didn't violate their freedom. Just imagine if you had some way to do that with your child. And that's what you do. I mean, with your child, you're advising the child, to go on a good path. You're adjusting their thoughts. Literally, you're appealing to their thoughts and feelings. You're saying, you'd feel better if you don't, drink 18 ounces of Pepsi, and so you want to guide them. So thought adjuster is this indwelling spirit adjusting your thoughts. Now it sounds like it's intrusive, but they don't mean that. And they have absolutely fabulous chapters in the Urantia book that explain how that works. And it's simply that God loves us so much that God sends a part of God's self to be in you, to guide you and adjust your thinking, but never violate your free will. So how can it do that? Well, it can give an inspiration to you, and you say, well, I've had an intuition. Well, that's coming from this thought adjuster, which is trying to adjust your thinking on that subject, right? So it may pop into your head. It's like, where did I get that from? That's a cool idea. That's the thought adjuster adjusting your thinking.
So
that help?
What? So this is where I'm a bit confused, or not confused, but let's say that we have, is the thought adjuster part of what we call the soul, or part of what we call what? Or how does that fit in there?
Right. So it's, as I was saying before, it's ontologically distinct from the soul. So the thought adjuster is a fragment of God. Just as you're saying in your book, or as you're quoting Michael Newton, that there's this egg of spirit that's pure spirit. It's not like half and half. It's pure spirit. It's the real deal.
So that the thought adjuster is the holographic fragment of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's not the soul. That's the thought adjuster.
That's a thought adjuster, but you and I prefer not to say that term. We prefer to say it's the holographic fragment. And the Urantia book says God fragment all the time.
God fragment. Now, okay, so that's the God fragment. Now, what is the soul as compared to that?
So again, the soul is a little embryo in the child, right? And the child has this robust spirit self that's dormant until the child grows sufficiently that the child has moral autonomy. So this sort of, they say in psychology, a child can really make free choices around age 6. So at that point, the soul is just a little embryo. It's basically non-existent. It's a potential. There's no soul. So that's why it's not reincarnating per se, although there's a footnote I got to give you later. But so the child doesn't have an evolved soul. The child, because of the presence of this thought adjuster, this spirit self, it's inspiring the kid to make choices. which toy do I want to play with? Will I share my toys with my sibling? Will I obey my parents? These are moral choices. So as a child makes these free choices, the soul grows one step. Literally each choice grows the soul one step. So you have thousands of decisions you make, or hundreds of decisions you make in a day. Your soul has grown 100 times. As long as they're true moral decisions. So there's an alchemical thing going on here, right? Where this pure spirit self that is catalyzing, that is working with you co-creatively to make better choices for the good, the true, the beautiful, right? That's what it wants.
Right. So I remember that one of the favorite phrases, or one of the phrases, was that an incarnation was, for a soul, quote, a short, intense test at the outset.
That the incarnation is a short, intense test.
At the outset.
Only at the outset.
Well, no, I'm saying that rather than reincarnation, in other words, you have a soul, and you have a thought adjuster, and you have a body. And somehow they all come together on planet Earth. And that constitutes a short, intense test for that soul in its universe journey. I'm just kind of illustrating the Urantia perspective.
That's the Urantia notion, is that it is an intense test. It's very brief, 80 years, 90. And so if that soul doesn't really grow, they kind of fail the test. However, there's love and mercy. So in the afterlife, and you get into the afterlife, and they say, all you did was Harry Madoff, all you did was a Ponzi scheme, and you ripped off, thousands of investors. So your soul's pretty small. But in defense of Madoff, he's got a little bit of soul because he loved his wife. We know that. He cared about certain things. He loved his dog or something, So he has a little tiny soul there. So he doesn't get cast away into the outer darkness. He's given mercy.
Yeah.
So they say, here's your life review. Look at all the people that suffered. But you can start over here in the higher worlds.
Yeah.
Rehabilitation.
You can start here where?
Upstairs. You get, in the next life, you get another shot.
Oh, so there are successive lives.
Yeah, so we should get into that because it's related to your book too, the Omnivores. So that's an ascension. This is an ascension scheme, an ascension cosmology. Everybody's ascending.
Right.
And they are, so what I find extremely valuable for this discussion, for your listeners, is you want to see what it looks like to have an ascension cosmology, if you're up for that, into that. The Urantia book is by far the best model of that because it gives so much more detail than any other text in world literature of the higher worlds and the so-called heavenly life.
Right. Now, okay, so how are thought adjusters doled out then, and how does one? Because I remember reading that and in that life, this person was especially blessed because they let him borrow as thought adjuster, because a very experienced thought adjuster was lent out to that person for that life. Could you talk more about that kind of thing?
Yeah, so we're going into abstruse realms. I'll take it.
No, I mean maybe this is
happy to do it.
Inside baseball, but do you think it's
right? So the notion of getting an experienced spirit is very important because on more advanced planets, everybody gets an experienced thought adjuster, meaning it's not a virgin. So the first time So, my mother said to me, Byron, you got to be a virgin soul. You're so naive, when I was a kid. I was just making all these terrible mistakes. And she says, you're not an old soul, but other people are old souls. You can just kind of tell. A kid comes in and they're like, already seems to be well-oriented at a young age. And so that's some kind of evidence that people come in with experienced thought adjusters now. So, but it's not, so let me get technical. So your spirit self, of course, is the co-sponsor of your soul. So we're saying the soul is evolving in your mind. It's there behind the scenes. But if the person dies, they get to the next dimension and they're given an option. They're told, look, you lived this kind of life on planet Earth, and it was not the best life. But if you want to have rehabilitation lovingly provided, you can go on. But if you don't want to go on, you don't have to. You can just not go on. It's like saying, I don't want to go to college. I just want to graduate high school. You don't go on to college. So you decide not to go on into the ascension. And that's like saying, I never want to go to Europe. I'm never going to go. To hell with Europe. I'm never going to go to Europe. I don't want to see it. I've seen enough United States, so just snuff me out. And it's sort of like that because a person, so the Bible says that God judges you and you go into hell, which is a primitive and mythic idea. But, an advanced teaching says, number one, God is not angry, an angry God. Number two, there is no hell. That's a crazy mythic pre-modern idea of punishment. It's a silly notion, but there's some truth in a sense that you are judged by God because God knows you in perfection, and so God's angels say, look, we know your situation. We're going to give you all the resources you need, but if you're weary of this, Adolf Hitler, if you're weary of this, you cause the death of millions. You're going to have to make amends. And if you don't want to deal with it, we will allow you to not exist. So the reason I'm telling you this, Alfred, is the soul of that person doesn't die. Just the personality goes away. But the soul is preserved. Why? Because that's a valuable record of something in the universe that's irreplaceable in eternity. Why would you snuff that out? That's a terrible idea. The universe is very interested in conservation of resources. So they will, that soul, let's say it's a person who's a petty criminal somewhere and they die. So they decide they don't want to survive. They're shown the afterlife. You're going to have this great time. You're going to see your relatives. You're going to live on these higher worlds. You're going to get this, and I don't want to do it. I was a fuck up. I don't even want to go. So they take that person's soul and its associated spirit, the spirit self, the thought adjuster. The custody of that soul is in the hands of the thought adjuster. You cannot snuff out a thought adjuster. It is a fragment of God. So it has the soul associated with it of that person who died eternal death. The Bible calls it the second death. So this person is no longer existent, but the valuable parts are. Those valuable parts are the spirit and the soul. So it's removed from the person and given to a new person. So that's what you're asking about. So that new person.
And who is that new person?
So that new person is born, say it was you. You were born in whenever it was, and your thought adjuster comes into you, and it had experience in a previous life. And so you may think you reincarnated, but you didn't. What incarnated was the experience of another person that's not you.
That's not me.
And it's very hard for my New Age friends to get this because they have the simplistic idea that the person reincarnates. So this is a more sophisticated idea. which says that if the person really blows it, they don't reincarnate, but their attainments do, their soul and the spirit, because the spirit self, when it comes into us, is a virgin. It has never been inside of a human being. And that is a very big challenge for a God fragment. Even if you're God, you're like, God, I got to deal with this crazy kid and adjust them and help them grow up. So that experience is extremely valuable. And these spirit monitors on the side of us become highly sort of trained by indwelling a person. So when they go into the next person, they're much more efficient. And that's why we have indigo children, for example, right? So the so-called indigo kids come in, they're advanced, you can tell. I mean, I just ran into one over the weekend, somebody's relative of mine. This kid is a genius. It's like smarter than me, it seems like. It's like 10 years old. And this kid obviously has an experienced thought adjuster. And the soul of so the Urantia book says that it's the soul of another person, but they're going to supplement that soul with their soul. So they're going to grow up and grow a soul, but they already have access to the memories of this other life.
Right. And that's exactly what you're stating there is what we termed in the context of, we termed the science of the omniverse and the science of the soul. And the science, because these subjects have been screened and have been blocked from science and from academia, and because they have been taken over by what are really political organizations that call themselves religions, that are primarily, in my judgment, religious organizations with belief structures, but primarily they are political organizations that are promoting certain belief structures over populations and are not, promoting scientific perspectives about the nature of the soul, the nature of God, etc. And so we were attempting to do a bridge there, because if you go to the book The Omniverse, this is just to show that was originally grew out of a request to us from Oxford University Press, which is the division of Oxford University, to write a book on extraterrestrials and the law, which then grew into the Omniverse and the science of the Omniverse. So, in a book that could be taught in any university department of cosmology, which in my judgment, as a person who's taught in two major universities, these subjects should not be forbidden from university teachings. They're absolutely forbidden now, and only certain universities will have the odd department of, where, and
parapsychology or
exactly.
Very
so, and that is, so how do you think? And so that was my attempt to open the gates whereby the science of the omniverse, whereby texts like the Urantia book would be a primary text in the science of the omniverse, if you follow my logic. That is, it is necessary. That is a new field, because in the same way that we have livers, we all have souls. So therefore, they're not to be tended by individuals that do not have a scientific background in the science of the soul. And yourself, who's going to the Union Theological Seminary, if that's the, can say, well, this deals with the science of the soul, and this is the revolution that has to happen inside these schools and inside these structures. It's a scientific one, because belief is no longer sufficient.
Right. Which is why I think I got admitted to this place, because they're in decline. These seminaries are in great decline, because people are not going to these churches, because people know this stuff is just a rehash, and it's pre-modern, it's outdated, so they don't go. Young people and millennials aren't going hardly at all. So they're like grasping at straws. So they said, okay, let Byron come in here and study the Urantia book. I mean, that's because I tried to get into another seminary years ago, and they wouldn't, let me in. And I was at University of California some time ago, and they kicked me out, basically, graduate program, because I said I wanted to do a dissertation on the Urantia book. And they said, well, you can't do that here. I mean, we don't do that. In fact, they abolished their religious studies department when I was there, saying there is no such thing as religion. It's flat out. All those professors that I was beginning to work with, it was in an interdisciplinary program with emphasis on philosophy of religion. And then halfway through it, they abolished the religion department. So they said, Byron, you can't be here studying the Urantia book because we don't have anybody in the field. We're kicking them out. They moved on. And that's typical. And so many other Urantia people have tried this, and none of us have been able to. No one's ever written a dissertation on the Urantia book. It's never happened. I mean, it's crazy. There's 1 million copies in print.
Well, that's why it's. How much have you found out there on the approach into the science of God, the science of the soul, the science of the afterlife, the science, where it's not belief, it's the science of it?
In the academic world, I can hardly think. I mean, there's at JFK University, as you know, there's the parapsychology program. I think that's where it is. And in my area, at JFK University, John F. Kennedy. Yeah, and John Klimo teaches there and stuff, and it's a pretty good place, but it's very tiny. I mean, I can't think of, Alfred, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to think of any sort of accredited university that studies, paranormal, University of Arizona, because they have, what's his name, Schwartz, who's a one-man, sort of a maniac professor. He's got tenure, and he's bringing this in. As you may know, his work is fabulous on the afterlife, on paranormal telepathy. He has a lab, and they can't get rid of him. But he's created a revolution at University of Arizona, Tucson, and he comes in keynotes at these very far out conferences on near-death experience, and he's the only professor that I've ever seen do anything like this, really. And he's just indomitable. But the Institute for Noetic Sciences is pioneering, as you know, in this field, but they don't really have academic affiliations, really. There was, remember, Russell Targ's daughter.
Right.
But she was an MD. She was doing research at Pacific Medical Center, I think it was. More paranormal kind of stuff and distant healing. But it's believed that she was assassinated.
Who would do that?
There are a lot of forces. I mean, she had a $25 million grant to study distance healing.
Ah.
And her husband, Mark Cummings, who you might know, is a pioneer of free energy research. That's what he told me, that was like an assassination. He says, I can't prove it, but it's my wife, and I saw what happened. And, that's just one example of many examples of people who've been moved out of academia But beyond that, in the churches, now and then a prophet will rise up and we'll talk about this stuff, and they kill them, right? But you got in the Pentecostal movement, there's something pretty good there. People think of that as sort of right wing and backward, but a lot of Pentecostals are really open to this stuff. And but their seminaries are kind of backwards. They're not scientifically oriented, but they're having experience, and they're letting people go out and experience these things of the soul in their churches. And I've been to their churches. I think it's commendable. And so they have a kind of science of the soul in these Pentecostal churches, where they have a certain knowledge and a certain protocol for how to prophecy, as they call it, and speaking in tongues. But they have telepathy, they have healing, they have distance healing, they have prayer induced healing. That lots of research has been done. So there's that. But it's we're all just barely getting anywhere with this. It's so that's why the Urantia book is little known, because it's really 100 years ahead of its time, but we're catching up with it. But to somebody like me, I mean, I have to spend all my discretionary funds doing what I do. I can't make a living doing this.
Right. Yeah. Now, the Urantia book was self-styled as what, the fifth epochal revelation. Could you describe what the other epochal revelations were, and just for us to get a kind of a feel for it?
Yeah. So I think the last time I saw you was at Contact in the Desert, where
a couple of years ago. Yeah, I was asked to the first one, and then I became persona non grata for things that haven't been explained.
Me too. They won't even talk to me, But I was there twice, and so I'll tell you what I said there at that conference about epical revelation, right? That so if the Urantia book is the fifth great revelation, supposedly, so the fourth is the incarnation of Jesus, and then previous to that, none of the earlier great revelations are even known in history, other than what they call the third one. So in the third one, Alfred, was the initiation of Judaism. In Genesis, if you know your Bible, there was an initiatory moment for Abraham, right? That's when the high priest Melchizedek walked into his tent and said, "Hi, I'm the high priest Melchizedek. You, Abraham, are going to start a new community, and it's going to number like the stars of heaven, and you are going to be the leader of this new nation. It will be called Israel," right? So this person, Melchizedek, if you go up to Mount Shasta, where I was this weekend, everybody thinks they can see Melchizedek, but Melchizedek is a historic person that is in the Bible. But the Urantia book says that Melchizedek was an emergency incarnation whose job was to restore monotheism. So that's the third epical revelation. And then the second, so I'm going in backward order. So the second great revelation was Adam and Eve. So people ask me, like, Byron, how could you believe in something like Adam and Eve? I mean, that's just a fairy tale. But the Urantia book has a great deal of detail. And I don't know if you know that there was an expedition to the site of Eden that was covered by the History Channel, which I was part of, in which they found artifacts. That was the History Channel 2007. And there was a previous expedition. This is underwater expeditions. This is with special underwater technology to look for artifacts. They look for sunken ships and things like that, right? But this was looking for the artifacts of the Garden of Eden, according to the Urantia book. So it was a pretty wild thing to do, but they tell you exactly where this is going to be. and what you're going to find there. So, some visionary Urantia people raised money, and I was part of that. And there was a book about it, which I edited and published. I didn't write it, but I edited and published. And in this book, or in the expedition, they raised enough money to go out into the ocean between Syria and Cyprus. That area, if you remember in the Urantia book, the Cyprus was the site of Eden. Some people call it Atlantis. But a part of Cyprus sunk into the ocean. And it wasn't known in science that there was a sunken area until the 70s. So Urantia people found out about that, and it's validated by underwater exploration, actually by the Israeli Geological Department. And they found this sunken area that is exact dimensions, width and length, as the Urantia book tells you. So it's on that basis we raised money to go down and see if we could find this civilization, and we found a wall down there. And that's at discoveryofatlantis.com. And so now, so again, we're talking about the second epical revelation. That's the advent of Adam and Eve on the planet. We have revived this idea, and I'm working with a very well-known mariner who's the Urantia book, who's a guy who's a underwater research guy, a veteran. And he and I have proposed to Scripps Institute of Underwater Archaeology that they be our partner, and we are in touch with the top person. And it just wrote a very positive letter to us. And, we've said him, this elaborate analysis of the data that we got from the History Channel expedition. I mean, it's a big deal, and he's interested. So we're thinking they may fund the third expedition. So anyway, that's the second great event. But the original event, you may remember, because you wrote about in your first book, is the Lucifer Rebellion.
Yeah.
Right. So that was not an epical event, but the event that precedes that is the first advent of extraterrestrials on the planet. According to this, was 500,000 years ago, which coincidentally is what Sitchin says in his reading of the Sumerian tablets, but he's got a very different interpretation. And as you may know, Sitchin also says they had a rebellion. And Sitchin also says, with the Urantia book, it was 200,000 years ago. So it's a pretty amazing overlap of Sitchin, but Sitchin calls them the Anunnaki. And they come from Planet X, and they have this, crazy mission. But the Urantia book says that they were actually extraterrestrials come here who are benign. And they were teaching humans the arts of civilization, and that's the first epical revelation. So to go over that again, so the first one is 500,000 years ago. The second one is 40,000 years ago, Adam and Eve. The third one is the initiation of Judaism by Melchizedek. That's 4,000 years ago. So right, because Moses is about BC 1000, but this is the the beginning of Judaism in the Canaan area of Abraham being egged on by this supernatural being, basically saying, "This land is yours." Create a base area of operation to create a new nation. So Abraham says, "Well, look, I can't even. My wife is old. I'm really old. How am I going to do this?" Well, they miraculously allowed him to, have progeny and have children. And so Jews should know this. I mean, they do know this, but they don't have the Urantia story, which is a huge backstory that says that Melchizedek was present in a town called Salem, which later became Jerusalem. So this incarnation, this being now the third epical revelation, this incarnation was to correct the evolutionary religions, which were polytheistic, and to help them become monotheistic, and his emissaries went to Egypt and influenced Akhenaten to become monotheistic. So you know the story, right? So monotheism comes to Egypt from a very mysterious sort of source from one of the pharaohs who went against the grain, right? And it really upset the priesthood in Egypt, and they overthrew him. So we celebrate, the monotheism of Egypt, but the priesthood was polytheistic, and they overthrew that. And as a result, Egypt did not become the site for the fourth epochal revelation, which was Jesus. So you had to have a monotheism somewhere to have Jesus incarnate. That's why Judaism was initiated. Judaism was initiated so that the Messiah could come, and the Messiah could say, "The one God loves you," the one, I am sent from the Father. I am sent from the one God who loves you, and we are here to, help you thrive. And so it would have incarnated in Egypt, we think, because Egypt was a great empire and had great resources, but Egypt fell and became backward and polytheistic, basically. I mean, they had a great reign of civilization, but so Jesus chose to incarnate in Israel because Israel had a decent, pretty good civilization, but it was one-sided. It was fanatical, and it was hyper-religious. And so when he incarnated there as the Messiah, they couldn't stand it and they killed him. But it was the only place where a monotheism could take root with a prophet like Jesus. So that's your fourth epochal event, is Jesus coming. And so his emissaries, fan out all over the world, and the most unlikely thing possible happened. I mean, they made it all the way to China, and they made it all the way to South America, and brought this into the world's biggest religion. And who would have thought that could have happened? But this was programmed to happen as the fourth epochal revelation, the teaching of the one God, the loving God, which never existed on the planet. There was no, even in Judaism didn't have a loving father of the individual. Judaism had a loving father of the nation of Israel. But it was really not a personal relationship, except in Isaiah and some of the other prophets. It's a personal, God loves you as a person. But the Jewish nation never really bought that. They believed that the nation had salvation. So Jesus was a threat to that. They had to assassinate him, but it survived. So this great revelation of a highly loving, personal father, mother survived. And so to refine that teaching, the Urantia book comes in, the fifth event. But we should back up and say that the typical planet has the same kinds of events, but the typical planet doesn't have an epochal calamity with the rebellion of the angels. So the rebellion of the so-called Lucifer rebellion is absolutely unprecedented. Yeah, so that's why it's important to know about life on other planets, because the Urantia book says other planets don't have atrocities. They don't have nuclear, they don't have Hiroshimas. They don't have holocausts. The universe is not filled with planets that have genocides all over the place. It just doesn't happen. We didn't design a universe, an omniverse, to have, wars of extinction. We didn't design a universe to have planets that snuff themselves out with climate change, whatever you may think of that, or with ecocide. That isn't how the universe is run. The universe is sustainable. but there are aberrational planets, like 1 in a million. So we're like 1 in a million, and you know that from reading the Urantia book. This is 1 in a million planets the planetary angels went to the dark side, and that happened after the first great epical extraterrestrial event, that these extraterrestrials were influenced by the angels who went to the dark side, right? So these angels that went to the dark side were influenced the extraterrestrials. And I noticed that you footnote Timothy Wiley's book, his work. And I don't know if you knew Timothy. I think you interviewed Timothy.
Yes, Timothy, who will be much missed because he passed over. He and I were neighbors in New York in the mid-'80s.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And we used to go out, and we used to hang out, you know, and yeah, we were.
Oh.
I remember having long philosophical conversations with Timothy at that time.
Well, that's really touches me to know that, you know, he was very close, and when he died, it was a big shock.
Yeah. Could you tell me more about the circumstances of his death? This is Timothy Wiley, who actually, he and I share publishers, Inner Traditions, who published The Omniverse, published his books. And could you say a bit about his books?
Absolutely. I published one of his books,
Yeah,
a great new set of books that you cite in your book fills in the backstory of this first epical revelation and what happened, and it's a big deal. And in fact, I just met with Timothy's son in Portland this weekend to ask him what are you going to do with the estate, because he's got the books, he's got, you know, this whole world of contacts. So that's a whole nother story. But toward the end of his life, he was contacted by one of the rebel angels. I don't know if you know that. So they're in the rehabilitation phase now of these rebel angels. And so after this calamity, you know, angels that were possessing individuals, you know, dark spirits, all the crazy Satanism that they inspired, you know, now they have been in this adjudication. We talked about the last time I was on that they were judged and adjudicated as a collective, and they were invited to rehabilitate in a complex. This is when we talk about universe law. You know, according to universe government, you know, the omniverse government of the local galaxy, they were given mercy if they would agree to rehabilitate. And so one of them, who's now rehabilitated, contacted Timothy. And, you know, Timothy is so clairvoyant, you know, he's the right guy. And they've downloaded 8 volumes history that it's not in the Urantia book. It tells you what happened after the rebellion of the Lucifer Rebellion. So that history is a fabulous read, but only the first 5 books are published. The 6th one's being printed, and the last 2 are left on his computer when he died. So they're trying to get that off the computer to get it printed.
Yeah. Did he die suddenly or what?
He died suddenly, had a massive heart attack, but I had invited him to join me in Denver in July at the International Urantia Conference.
Oh.
And he probably shouldn't have come. He was very weak, and but he really wanted to come because he wanted the Urantia people to see his work.
Yeah.
And so I put him in my booth. I had a booth, and otherwise he couldn't have done it. And I had my books and his books. And the Urantia people have been hands off with him because he's so far ahead of them. He's so far out, and he's received the revelation. And anyway, he was well received there, you know, to his surprise.
Okay.
And but after that, he died about 3 weeks after that. So I think it was a little taxing, but it's what he wanted. He wanted that community to know his work, which fills in, almost like 180,000 years of missing history.
Wow.
And the only thing we have today is Sitchin and the Anunnaki story, which is really not as interesting by any means, in my view, as this story. It's a very different story. But, it drives me crazy that Contact in the Desert, these other conferences, they just give open field to these Sitchin disciples talking about the Anunnaki, and they gave me one little room. Then they kicked me out like they kicked you out, right?
Yeah.
But at least they let me speak there. I think 3 times or twice about this alternate view of deep history.
Right.
And there was a lot of people like that, but it isn't what they like, because number one, it's not commercially profitable. And also Gaia TV had me on, and then they barred me from that as well. So it is getting out on this story, and Wiley's work will live.
Right. Now, because we're starting to get to the 1 hour and 45 minutes here, and there's one topic, and we're getting to the 5th epochal, that we're talking about the 5th epochal revelation following Jesus. And do they mention any revelation following the 5th epochal revelation?
Yeah, and my last interview was what we talked about, that, and if folks want to just refer to the last interview where I talked about the 6th of these. And so this is sort of like prophecy, but it's been received in channeling, a very, very extensive channeled discussion since maybe 15 years now. They've been telling different groups through channels, Urantia channels, that there will be a mission of incarnation. And this is not the second coming of Christ. This is prep for that. And this is going to be a high being who will come as an adjudicator of the age, so to speak. So if you may remember, Alfred, I think this was of great interest to you last time, because this is a magistrate. It's like a legal dispensation where they induce the it brings justice to the planet, but it's spiritual justice, so it's full of mercy. But this being is present now, and is with a huge retinue of angelic beings, and it's known as the magisterial mission. And this mission, I published one book on this. It's called Healing a Broken World. And this being will incarnate physically.
In the future?
In the near future, in the next 20, 30 years.
20, 30 years. Now, and it's clear that that individual will not be the second coming of Jesus of Nazareth.
This is the preface, the prologue to his return, because for him to return, they first have to bring justice, but Jesus, being the creator, cannot be the one who dispenses justice. The universe has division of power, so to speak, right? So a creator can't judge the creature. They have a separate judicial, like as their own judiciary, a separate judiciary on high, and their work is the adjudication of not the individual, but the age of they terminate the age by judging the age, and you can see it, and then those souls are judged, but they're judged mercifully.
Right. Now, do you ever? This is one of the things is that even going back to 1980s, I remember the 1970s with the book, The Late Great Planet Earth. Remember that one? And there's been an enormous investment and resurgence in, I would call it hermeneutic fundamentalism. And hermeneutic fundamentalism says sort of, oh, we're literally in the end times now, literally in the latter days, and we can expect Jesus Christ to come right now. And the problem with that is that if one is if one brings in other time frames, such as the 5th and 6th epochal revelations, those who are following fundamentalist hermeneutics, I mean, they, get very upset and can even say, well, that's diabolical, or that's heresy, or da, da, da. And that's really unfortunate, because especially in quote Christian countries, I mean, leaving the Catholic Church aside, which is like an entity unto itself, that isn't even Christian in a way. But the Jesus is coming now movement, it seems to me, is counterproductive to the true Christianity, in that they're forcing a belief system which is not scientific, because it's not scientific that this is the time that Jesus would return. I'm asking that as a general interview scientific question. Could you sort of deal with that whole thing?
Well, again, I sort of give the philosophic reason for it, which is that first you have to end the reign of injustice. So they would say, well, Jesus will come and Jesus will end the reign of injustice, meaning Jesus has to judge, the cabal, as we call it, right? But that's against universal law. Jesus cannot judge his own creatures. That's a separate function, as I was saying, a judicial function. So he cannot come back as long as the cabal has not been terminated. But it is being terminated. In the, if David Wilcock is right and Benjamin Fulford, a lot of this stuff is disinformation, but a lot of it is right. There is black hats and white hats. Maybe we've had a purge of the black hats in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. That may be evidence of the judgment, so to speak. That's the faction aligned with the Bush crime family, as far as I'm concerned, that they purged in Saudi Arabia, and that's what David Wilcock is saying now openly. That's a white hat, event, and you can see in all sorts of the outing all of this philandering and molesting of women by people like Charlie Rose. This is an acceleration of a kind of judgment of the facts coming out. The disclosure project, all these different disclosures have to happen before Christ can come. Christ is not the one to do that. That's done by other forces. So Christ comes to declare the victory of the light. And gives, anchors that as a new age, the new age, or Timothy Wiley called it the true age. So the use of the Book of Revelation in the Bible it's a little pathetic, because this is a ancient document. It's full of errors. It's mythic. It's not a reliable document for prophecy. It's useful But if that's, that's why you need something like the Urantia book. You need an update of prophecy, in a scientific cosmology. I mean, that's from a flat Earth medieval mentality. It can't be anything accurate. It might be accurate spiritually, the Book of Revelation, and the hope for the return. That's the proper thing. But we need a new foundation, and that's consistent with divine love, the divine. You wouldn't let your kid have textbooks that are 2,000 years old. You want your kid to have the newest textbooks. So the Urantia book is like the new textbook.
Yeah, I really enjoyed some of the demystifications that the Urantia book did of the Book of Revelation, for example, stating that the reference to 666 is actually the last three, 666 is actually the last three numbers in the planetary registry number of this planet, which is called Urantia, in the planetary registry number of planet Earth, in the universe registry of life-bearing planets. And
right.
that John of Patmos, in his mescaline-fueled, vision, if that's what he took, had gone up to the Akashic records and seen 666 and conflated it in the Book of Revelation with, some guy, and he was just reading the planetary registry number of planet Earth, which is in the Akashic records, and then, wrote it into the Book of Revelation, which is then incorporated into, our Bible, Old and New Testament, So that is a type of deconstruction which I thought was fascinating. I said, wow, they're really sort of deep. Isn't that an amazing fact to kind of pass on? Do you have any comment on that?
Some years ago, I published a book on this called The Secret Revelation. It was authored by a woman now deceased.
Oh.
She was it was called The Secret Revelation. I forget, but it was like the late great planet Earth, right? This is a correction to the late great, to the Christian fundamentalists, because the brilliant woman that asked the celestials, the Urantia beings, would you tell me what is going on here? Why is everybody talking about the return of Jesus when the Urantia book says it's not going to happen? So for 4 years, they spoke with her. And they went through every line of the Book of Revelation, and they told her what the code is. And they said that, the image of the Antichrist, for example, was entirely concocted. It was not even in the original vision. And many, like 100 things like that. They demystified it. And anyway, it was a funny story because I was at the Book Expo America. We have your books out in your booth. And we met the author of the Left Behind series. You know that series?
Could you refresh our recollection?
It's the book after the late great planet Earth, which sold 10 million copies. His book sold 40 million copies.
Whoa.
So it's called Left Behind. It's the people that were left behind after the rapture, right? So it's the story of the people. Oh my God. And it's actually not a bad read. And there are, I think, three volumes, but his book sold 40 million copies and our book sold 400 copies. But I think our book had more truth in it. But yeah, it just shows you. And anyway, this prophetic text is, it's just myth. And also the Urantia being said there was a vision, but it was redacted and revised when it was copied, by monks, and it's not unreliable. So too bad for that. But so the Christians are relying on these ancient texts, and in 1945 we got the Nag Hammadi manuscripts,
right,
which was really embarrassing to Christians because, it really upstaged them. Because these were scriptures like the New Testament that were suppressed.
Yeah.
And they tell a better story.
Yeah.
Now,
do you think here we have the fifth epochal revelation, which was a book that came through the Urantia book. I mean, 1 million copies is a lot of copies for a book that's
like that.
Substantial, yeah.
And 17 languages, which is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that for me, that's an epochal accomplishment. And, with that degree of integrity to the copyright and everything else. And we don't know, and you mentioned about the magisterial son. Now, do you think it is that the Urantia book is just kind of, like you mentioned, a young soul, it's just like budding right now, and that a century from now or 2 centuries, it'll be like it's the Urantia. When you come to Urantia, what do you read? You read the Urantia book. You follow what I'm saying?
I don't know.
We are like the early pioneers in Urantia. I was one of the early souls who read the Urantia book. And, one of the early few 100,000 of the 7 billion that read the Urantia book. And then 100 years from now, there's a big sign on planet Earth that says, "Welcome to Urantia." And, it's like, that's what you do when you come here. Is that what you think it's gonna be like?
Well, it'll be like, 20 years from now, we'll be old guys, and they'll come to us and they'll say, "What was it like back then?" So, back in my day, no one ever listened to me. They wouldn't talk to me. My wives would leave us, because this thing is so heretical. But I don't know, Alfred. I mean, I just came back from a tour in North California and Oregon, and it's very small crowds come to see this. It's totally unknown to,
yeah. So
it's basically failing. At the moment, it seems to be failing.
It's these great paradoxes. And yet I know that you and I had a conversation. This is, I sort of like to speak to a conversation with you. And I remember we were at some gathering. It might have been one of the gatherings one of the conferences that you just mentioned, Contact in the Desert or some other. And we were talking to each other, and you said, the Urantia book, it might be a failed revelation. And I looked at you, failed? No, look at it. I mean, look, exopolitics, that exopolitics itself, my book, Exopolitics, was just a popularization of Urantia. That's all it is. The Omniverse was just, it's just another way of presenting the cosmology that was presented in this tremendous interdimensional thing, and put it into a language that a Don or that a class at Oxford University or at the University of California or wherever, or at Union Theological Seminary. I mean, if they ever want me to give a lecture at the Union Theological Seminary, I'll do it. And so my response to you is, no, listen, it's exploding. I mean, because the Urantia revelation is just, it's right at the edges of the thought. Because think of this, we cannot apply human time to revelation time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, this is eons. And you know, they have the familiar thing of third density, fourth density, fifth density, and you know, and I really don't know how to translate that. But if this in fact was Urantia, and if this in fact was a chosen planet for an incarnation of a paradise son of God, I mean, it's a very special planet. So there's like a creation story that's going on in this, which is like, you know, it's like the universe movies that's happening here, you know, happening here. So I would think that given that's, I mean, the fourth revelation, it took 2,000 years from the fourth revelation to when the fifth revelation came. That's 2,000 years. So now the fifth revelation just happened, right? So think of the distance between the fifth. You know, just for the propagation of the fifth, you know, it's just going to take so much.
And it has an opposition. And you know, you're up against that. So that's why, you know, when I say,
listen, you look at the challenges that we had in just putting together this program. I mean, all our emails were erased. We couldn't get together. I mean, the amount of resistance to the fifth apocalyptic revelation and just us getting together to put together this webinar, the amount of resources that have been put together by the Matrix, you know, internet counter COINTELPRO, you know, is like amazing. and you know, and yet here we are. And so I would say that the fifth apocalyptic revelation is just beginning to play itself out.
You know, it's only been 60 years, and let's say in 200 years, yeah, it's going to be incredible, and it'll be used as a reference text in universities. And there'll be other revelations that'll build upon it, like Wiley's work, and so much more to come. And your book, too, builds upon it. Your work builds, you know, so it's a happening thing. But at the moment, in the worldly sense, it's not known. It's not a fact. But that's just narrow, and I don't want to be too narrow about it. But it's my own perception, my experiences, that starting at square one with almost everybody.
Yeah. No, I mean, what kind of made me jump up and down was when you said the Urantia book is 100 years ahead of its time. And I went, because my wife, Jerry, who's an accomplished psychic, she always tells me, says, Alfred, you're 100 years ahead of your time. So I went, well, I guess so. I guess I'm with the fifth apocalyptic revelation, so we're 100 years ahead of our time. Well, this is an extraordinary pleasure, and I see that we're at the 2 hour, over the 2 hour mark, which is what, you know, about when people, that's about when the great meal is, you know, done. And I'm wondering, is there anything that you had wanted to share with our audience today that you had not had the opportunity to share?
I think the only other thing is to notice that the cabal, if you will, that the Urantia book is an expose on them because it talks about the Lucifer Rebellion, and that's their legacy, that's their lineage. That's what I think they source from, and sort of the satanic activities we see with ISIS, you know, funding ISIS and that kind of desperate activity of the cabal goes all the way back to that lineage. So it's a better way to understand our history in regard to the current struggle with the finalizing the cabal, the reign of the Luciferic party, which I like to call it. And the Urantia book it's like a handbook for those who are fighting that battle today. It gives you the backstory, and so it's a struggle over the human soul and over knowing what the soul is, because they're obscuring who we are. That's part of their work, and so that we have to recover our soul through the exposing who we are, where we came from, where things went astray, and we need to recover ourselves with the help of the Urantia book. So I guess that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah. Now, this is your book, Your Evolving Soul. Where can people get in touch with you? People who want to contact you, how in touch with your work, in touch with the Urantia book, if this has sparked their interest. I know that people can read it online for free. Could you kind of bring everybody up to date?
You can easily download the Urantia book for free. It's easy to find. My book is available everywhere. I'd love to get your audience to watch my podcast. I just started a video cast, what I call Zoomcasts, with commentators about the Urantia book, but they're not Urantia book students. They're looking in and appreciating it. And that's at Evolving-Souls, evolving, then a hyphen, and SOULS.org, and sign up there and get these updates, because I'm in touch with all the principal players in this, and I'm increasingly reporting on sort of the Urantia news, the Urantia movement news. So yeah, that's it. And if you want to get the Urantia book, go to urantia.org. That's probably the best site, or urantiabook.org is the other good website. And then mine, which is more the esoteric aspect of it. So there you have it. And they can contact me at evolving-souls.org.
Well, Byron, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for undertaking the mission which you have undertaken. I'm very grateful for it. Many people are very grateful for it, because the Urantia book is just it's a permanent presence in all of our lives, and it's something that we all can rely on and can fall back on, and kind of an eternal resource for us. And so we thank you for kind of being a curator, a deep curator of the Urantia book on our planet for our age.
Thank you. That is my work, and I don't know how often you get acknowledged, Alfred, for your work, but going through your book, looking what you do, there's nobody doing what you're doing. No wonder your wife says you're way ahead of your time. So thank you for your work, and thank you. This has just been a fabulous discussion. I've just so much enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so much.
God bless you. Stay in touch. Bye now.
Okay. Bye-bye.